Hello, and welcome to Alien Nature for Sleep. Tonight, we journey to worlds orbiting the most common stars in our galaxy, red dwarfs. These small, cool suns shine with a dim crimson glow, burning for trillions of years. Around them, planets huddle close, bathed in strange light. Some are locked in eternal embrace with their stars, one face forever bright, the other forever dark. Others orbit within zones where liquid water might pool on rocky surfaces, where chemistry could build complexity, where life might find a way. The possibilities are vast, and the challenges are many. Yet life on Earth has shown us that it adapts to conditions we once thought impossible. From bacteria thriving in boiling springs to organisms surviving beneath Antarctic ice, life finds its niches in the most unexpected places. If life arose elsewhere, on worlds so different from our own, how would it adapt? What forms might it take? What colors would paint its surfaces? And what strategies might evolution craft to meet the unique demands of existence beneath a red sun? These questions guide tonight's exploration. We will move slowly through the science, examining each aspect with patience and wonder. The universe stretches before us, filled with red dwarf systems waiting to tell their stories. Let us begin our gentle journey into these alien realms, where light falls differently, where time moves to a different rhythm, and where life, if it exists, has written its own remarkable chapter in the cosmic narrative. Red dwarfs, known to astronomers as M-type stars, represent the most abundant stellar population in our Milky Way galaxy. These small, cool stars comprise approximately 70 to 80% of all stars in existence. Despite their overwhelming numbers, not a single red dwarf is visible to the naked eye from Earth. Their light is simply too faint, too dim to pierce the darkness without the aid of telescopes. Even Proxima Centauri, the nearest star to our sun and a red dwarf itself, remains invisible to unaided human vision despite being only 4.2 light years away. These stars are defined primarily by their mass, which ranges from approximately 0.08 to 0.6 times the mass of our sun. Below this lower limit, an object cannot sustain the nuclear fusion of hydrogen and becomes instead a brown dwarf, a failed star that never quite ignited. Above the upper limit, a star transitions into the K-type classification, slightly hotter and larger than a red dwarf. The mass of a star determines nearly everything about its nature. Its temperature, its luminosity, its color, and crucially for our purposes, its potential to harbor habitable worlds. Surface temperatures of red dwarfs range from approximately 2,000 to 3,700 degrees Kelvin, considerably cooler than our sun's surface temperature of about 5,700 degrees Kelvin. This lower temperature shifts their light output toward the red and infrared portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Their spectral signature shows strong absorption bands from titanium oxide and other molecules that would be broken apart in hotter stellar atmospheres. The result is a star that glows with a deep red or orange hue, emitting most of its energy at wavelengths longer than visible light. The luminosity of these stars varies dramatically with their mass, but all red dwarfs are dim compared to solar-type stars. The smallest red dwarfs emit only about 1/10,000th the luminosity of our sun, while the largest approach about 10% of solar luminosity. This faintness has profound implications. For a planet to receive enough warmth for liquid water, it must orbit much closer to a red dwarf than Earth orbits the sun. This proximity creates a cascade of consequences that shape every aspect of potential life on such worlds. Red dwarfs are fully convective stars, meaning that the material inside them circulates throughout their entire volume. Unlike our sun, which only burns hydrogen in its core, a red dwarf constantly mixes its fuel supply, bringing fresh hydrogen from the outer layers down to the fusion zone and cycling helium-rich material outward. This complete mixing has a remarkable consequence. Red dwarfs can burn their entire hydrogen supply, not just the 10% available in a non-convective star's core. As a result, these stars can live for extraordinary lengths of time. The smallest red dwarfs have theoretical lifespans measured in trillions of years, far exceeding the current age of the universe, which stands at about 13.8 billion years. Even the largest red dwarfs will shine for tens of billions of years. In contrast, our sun will exist for roughly 10 billion years total. This longevity makes red dwarfs fascinating targets for astrobiology. If life requires time to evolve complexity, these stars offer more time than any other stellar type. The universe itself is not yet old enough for even one red dwarf to have completed its life cycle. When a red dwarf finally exhausts its hydrogen fuel in the distant future, it will not expand into a red giant as our sun will. Instead, it will contract and heat up, becoming a blue dwarf star, before eventually cooling into a white dwarf. The first blue dwarfs will not appear for many billions of years. Until then, red dwarfs continue their patient burn, converting hydrogen into helium atom by atom, photon by photon, maintaining their dim glow across eons. Their small size, ranging from about 9% to 60% the radius of the sun, means that planets passing in front of them block a significant fraction of their light. This makes red dwarf systems ideal targets for transit photometry, the method by which most exoplanets are discovered. When a planet crosses between us and its star, the dimming is more noticeable around a small red dwarf than around a larger star like our sun. This observational advantage has led to the discovery of numerous rocky planets in red dwarf systems. These stars also exhibit intense magnetic activity, particularly when young. Their surfaces are often covered in star spots, dark regions of intense magnetic fields that can reduce a red dwarf's luminosity by as much as 40% for months at a time. The magnetic fields also generate powerful stellar flares, sudden eruptions of energy that can briefly increase a red dwarf's brightness by orders of magnitude. These flares release intense bursts of ultraviolet and X-ray radiation, potentially harmful to any planets orbiting nearby. The flare activity of red dwarfs changes over time. Young red dwarfs, in their first few 100 million years, experience frequent and powerful flares. These can be hundreds or even thousands of times more energetic than the largest solar flares ever recorded from our sun. As red dwarfs age, their rotation slows, their magnetic fields weaken, and flare activity generally decreases. By a few billion years of age, many red dwarfs have settled into a calmer existence, though some, like Barnard's star, continue to flare even at advanced ages. The combination of these factors creates a unique stellar environment. Red dwarfs are small, cool, long-lived, and prone to magnetic activity. Around them, planets must orbit close to receive adequate warmth, placing them in environments of intense stellar influence. Understanding red dwarfs is essential to understanding the potential for life in the galaxy. For if these stars cannot support habitable worlds, then perhaps 70 to 80% of the galaxy's real estate is unsuitable for life as we know it. The habitable zone, sometimes called the Goldilocks zone, is the region around a star where temperatures allow liquid water to exist on a planet's surface. This zone is neither too hot, where water would boil away, nor too cold, where it would remain permanently frozen. For red dwarfs, this zone lies much closer to the star than in our solar system, while Earth orbits the Sun at a distance of 1 astronomical unit, approximately 150 million kilometers. A planet in the habitable zone of a red dwarf might orbit at only 0.05 astronomical units or less. For the smallest, coolest red dwarfs, this distance shrinks even further. Planets in these zones complete their orbits in mere days or weeks rather than in months or years. The orbital period of a habitable zone planet around a red dwarf typically ranges from a few days to a few dozen days. This proximity has immediate consequences. The gravitational interaction between star and planet becomes much stronger when the two bodies are close together. Tidal forces, the same forces that cause Earth's ocean tides, become significant. Over time, these tidal forces slow a planet's rotation until it becomes synchronized with its orbit. This state, called tidal locking, means the planet rotates exactly once per orbit, keeping one face perpetually toward the star and the other face perpetually away. Our moon is tidally locked to Earth, which is why we always see the same face when we look up at night. Similarly, a tidally locked planet around a red dwarf would have a permanent day side and a permanent night side. The day side would receive constant starlight, never knowing darkness. The night side would see only stars, and perhaps the distant glow of the day side's atmosphere, never witnessing sunrise. Between these extremes lies the terminator zone, a ring of perpetual twilight where the star hangs forever on the horizon. For many years, scientists believed that tidal locking would render such planets uninhabitable. The reasoning was straightforward. The day side would become unbearably hot, while the night side froze solid. Any atmosphere would freeze out on the night side, leaving the day side bare and vulnerable. However, more sophisticated climate models have challenged this assumption. If a planet has a sufficiently thick atmosphere, heat can be transported from the day side to the night side through atmospheric circulation. Three-dimensional global climate models show that atmospheric winds can redistribute heat efficiently. Air heated on the day side rises and flows toward the night side at high altitudes. There it cools, descends, and returns to the day side near the surface, creating a global circulation pattern. This circulation can keep the night side warm enough to prevent atmospheric collapse. The exact thickness of atmosphere required depends on many factors, including the planet's distance from its star, the composition of the atmosphere, and the planet's surface properties. Recent research suggests that even planets with relatively thin atmospheres, comparable to or slightly thicker than Earth's, might avoid the worst consequences of tidal locking. Cloud formation on the day side plays a crucial role. As the substellar point, the spot directly facing the star, heats up, moist air rises and forms thick clouds. These clouds increase the planet's reflectivity, bouncing much of the stellar radiation back into space and cooling the day side. This creates a stabilizing feedback mechanism that prevents runaway heating. However, not all planets may escape tidal locking. Recent theoretical work has shown that planets with thick atmospheres, perhaps 10 times thicker than Earth's, might resist becoming fully tidally locked. The atmosphere itself can exert torque on the planet's solid surface, counteracting the tidal forces from the star. This atmospheric thermal tide, driven by heating and cooling cycles, could allow some planets to maintain slow but non-synchronous rotation. The width of the habitable zone around red dwarfs is narrower than around sun-like stars, but not as narrow as once thought. Three-dimensional climate models have actually expanded our estimates of habitable zone boundaries for tidally locked planets. The old models suggested that only a thin shell around the star could support liquid water. The new models show that the outer edge of the habitable zone extends farther than previously calculated, particularly for planets with thick atmospheres or high greenhouse gas concentrations. The inner edge of the habitable zone, where a planet becomes too hot for habitability, is also subject to debate. Planets at the inner edge risk entering a moist greenhouse state, where water vapor accumulates in the upper atmosphere. Ultraviolet radiation from the star can then split the water molecules, with hydrogen escaping to space and oxygen being lost or reacting with the surface. This process could desiccate a planet over millions of years, even while it remains in the nominal habitable zone. For some red dwarf systems, the habitable zone might overlap with the region where tidal heating becomes significant. When a planet's orbit is slightly elliptical rather than perfectly circular, its distance from the star varies during each orbit. This variation causes the tidal forces to strengthen and weaken rhythmically, flexing the planet's interior and generating heat through friction. This tidal heating can warm a planet considerably, potentially leading to volcanic activity, or even rendering the surface too hot for liquid water, despite being at a seemingly safe distance from the star. The concept of the habitable zone must also consider the star's evolution. Red dwarfs are born much brighter than they become in middle age. A young red dwarf in its first few 100 million years can be several times more luminous than it will be later. This means that the habitable zone migrates inward over time. A planet that forms in what will eventually become the habitable zone might initially be too hot, experiencing a runaway greenhouse effect that strips away its water before the star dims enough for the planet to become temperate. Despite these complexities, the habitable zones of red dwarfs potentially harbor more Earth-sized rocky planets than any other region of space. Surveys suggest that approximately 20 to 40% of red dwarfs host planets in their habitable zones. Given the enormous number of red dwarfs in the galaxy, this translates to billions of potentially habitable worlds. Whether these worlds actually support life remains an open question, but the sheer abundance ensures that red dwarf systems will remain prime targets in the search for life beyond Earth. Tidal locking creates one of the most striking differences between Earth and planets in red dwarf habitable zones. On a tidally locked world, the concept of day and night loses its familiar meaning. Instead, geography determines the illumination received by any location. The substellar point, located at the center of the day side, experiences perpetual noon. Here, the star hangs motionless at its zenith, never moving across the sky. Moving away from the substellar point in any direction, the sun appears lower in the sky. Eventually, one reaches the terminator, the boundary between day and night. The terminator is not a sharp line, but rather a broad transitional zone where the sun skims along the horizon. This twilight region could be hundreds or even thousands of kilometers wide, depending on the planet's size and atmospheric properties. Here, the sun neither rises nor sets, but remains fixed near the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of red and orange. Beyond the terminator lies the night side, a hemisphere of permanent darkness. Only starlight illuminates this region, along with any light that manages to scatter through the atmosphere from the day side. If the planet has auroras, they would be visible here, perhaps driven by interactions between the stellar wind and the planet's magnetic field. Bioluminescence, if it evolved, might dominate night-side ecosystems, providing the only local source of light. The temperature gradient between day and night sides would be extreme without atmospheric circulation. Climate models suggest that on a planet with little or no atmosphere, the day side could reach temperatures of hundreds of degrees Celsius, while the night side plunges to -100 degrees or colder. Between these extremes, only the terminator zone might maintain temperatures suitable for liquid water. This narrow habitable ring has led some researchers to speculate about eyeball Earths, where liquid water exists only in a circular region facing the star, surrounded by ice extending toward the dark side. However, atmospheres change this picture dramatically. Even a relatively thin atmosphere can transport significant heat through winds. On a tidally locked planet with an Earth-like atmosphere, climate models indicate that powerful jet streams would develop, carrying heat from the day side to the night side. Drawing from our understanding of atmospheric dynamics, the day side would likely feature an enormous permanent high-pressure system centered on the substellar point, with air flowing outward toward the terminator. On the night side, low pressure would dominate, with air spiraling inward. Cloud patterns on such a world would be remarkably different from Earth's. The substellar point would likely be covered by a persistent cloud formation, perhaps resembling a massive thunderstorm that never moves. As air rises in this convective system, moisture condenses, releasing heat and powering powerful winds that flow outward at high altitudes. The terminator might be a region of particularly active weather, where warm air from the day side meets cold air from the night side. Ocean currents would also play a crucial role in heat distribution. If a tidally locked planet has oceans, they would circulate heat much as Earth's oceans do, though the patterns would be quite different. A planet with a single global ocean might develop a circulation pattern with warm surface currents flowing from the substellar point toward the terminator and night side, while cold, deep currents return water toward the day side. Land masses would disrupt these patterns, creating complex regional climate systems. For photosynthetic life, the permanent illumination patterns would present both opportunities and challenges. On the day side, organisms could potentially engage in continuous photosynthesis, never needing to pause for nighttime. This could, in principle, allow for rapid energy acquisition and growth. However, the intensity of radiation, particularly during stellar flares, would necessitate protective mechanisms. On the night side, photosynthesis would be impossible without light, forcing any life there to rely on chemosynthesis or consume material produced elsewhere. The terminator zone represents perhaps the most intriguing environment for life. Here, light levels would be lower than on the day side, but still sufficient for photosynthesis, particularly for organisms adapted to low light conditions. The stable climate, with the sun always at the same angle, would eliminate seasonal variations. Life in the terminator could optimize its light harvesting apparatus for that specific geometry, never needing to adjust for changing sun angles, as Earth's life does throughout the day and year. Evolution on a tidally locked world would likely produce distinct biological zones corresponding to the illumination patterns, following the principle that organisms adapt to their local conditions. Day-side life would need protection from intense radiation and heat stress. This evolutionary pressure might lead to the development of reflective surfaces, pigments that absorb harmful ultraviolet while reflecting visible light, or behavioral strategies like retreating underground or underwater during stellar flares. Based on what we observe in terrestrial extremophiles, organisms might develop natural sunscreens, compounds that absorb ultraviolet radiation before it can damage cellular structures. Night-side life would face different challenges. Without photosynthesis, ecosystems would need to rely on chemical energy sources or on organic material transported from the day side. Drawing from Earth's deep-sea vent communities as analogs, hydrothermal vents, if present, could potentially support chemosynthetic communities. Alternatively, night-side life might depend on a steady rain of organic matter carried by winds or ocean currents from the productive day side. This would create an ecosystem structure quite different from anything on Earth, with primary production occurring in one hemisphere and consumption in another. The terminator zone could support the most diverse ecosystems, with moderate light levels, comfortable temperatures, and access to both day-side and night-side resources. This region might serve as the planet's primary habitat. Life here could engage in photosynthesis while also having access to reduced chemical compounds that accumulate on the night side. The constant twilight conditions could favor organisms with enhanced low-light vision or alternative light-sensing strategies. Some researchers have speculated that life might not remain permanently in one zone, but could migrate seasonally or cyclically. Although a tidally locked planet has no seasons in the traditional sense, other cycles might drive migration. Stellar flare activity varies over time scales of days to years. Organisms might move toward the terminator or night side during periods of high flare activity, returning to the day side during calmer periods. Such migrations would require sophisticated sensing abilities to detect changes in stellar radiation levels. The absence of a day-night cycle would also affect any potential circadian rhythms. On Earth, nearly all organisms have internal biological clocks synchronized to the 24-hour day. These rhythms regulate everything from sleep-wake cycles to metabolic processes. On a tidally locked world, particularly on the day or night sides, where light levels never change, such rhythms might not evolve at all. Alternatively, organisms might develop rhythms tied to other cycles, such as orbital variations, if the planet has a slightly eccentric orbit, or perhaps internal metabolic rhythms independent of external cues. Tidal locking also affects a planet's magnetic field generation. Earth's magnetic field is generated by the motion of liquid iron in its outer core, driven by the planet's rapid rotation, and by heat flow from the core to the mantle. A tidally locked planet rotates much more slowly, typically once per orbital period, which for a habitable zone red dwarf planet means once every few days or weeks. This slower rotation might weaken the dynamo effect that generates magnetic fields. A weak or absent magnetic field would have serious consequences for habitability. Magnetic fields deflect charged particles from stellar winds and flares, protecting the atmosphere from erosion. Without this protection, atmospheric particles could be ionized by stellar radiation and then swept away by the stellar wind. Over millions of years, this could strip away significant portions of the atmosphere, potentially rendering the planet uninhabitable. However, recent research suggests that even slowly rotating planets might maintain sufficient magnetic fields if their interiors remain molten and convective. Red dwarf stars, particularly young ones, are renowned for their powerful stellar flares. These sudden eruptions release enormous amounts of energy in very short time spans, sometimes doubling or even temporarily increasing a star's brightness by orders of magnitude. The flares emit radiation across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, from radio waves to X-rays, with particularly intense emission in the ultraviolet range. Physical mechanism behind these flares involves magnetic fields. Like our sun, red dwarfs have powerful magnetic fields generated by the motion of electrically conducting plasma in their interiors. These fields emerge from the star's surface, forming loops and complex structures. When the magnetic field lines become too tangled or stressed, they can suddenly reconnect, releasing the stored magnetic energy in a violent burst. This magnetic reconnection is the engine that powers stellar flares. For planets orbiting close to red dwarfs, these flares pose a significant hazard. Recent observations using the Galaxy Evolution Explorer Space Telescope have revealed that ultraviolet emission from red dwarf flares is approximately 3 times more intense than previously calculated, with some flares reaching 12 times the expected levels. This far ultraviolet radiation, with wavelengths shorter than 200 nanometers, is particularly dangerous because it can break chemical bonds in biological molecules and in atmospheric gases. A planet in the habitable zone of a red dwarf could receive hundreds or thousands of times more ultraviolet radiation during a flare than Earth receives from the sun during normal conditions. If such flares occur frequently, the cumulative radiation dose over a planet's lifetime could be substantial. Young red dwarfs, those less than a few 100 million years old, might produce these powerful flares daily or even multiple times per day. Only as the stars age and their rotation slows do flare rates generally decrease. The biological effects of this radiation depend on several factors. Ultraviolet radiation can damage DNA, causing mutations and potentially killing cells. On Earth, the ozone layer in our stratosphere absorbs much of the sun's ultraviolet radiation, protecting surface life. However, forming and maintaining an ozone layer requires oxygen, which on Earth is a byproduct of photosynthesis. A planet around a red dwarf would need to develop photosynthetic life and build up atmospheric oxygen before an ozone layer could form. Until then, surface life would face the full brunt of stellar ultraviolet radiation. However, ultraviolet radiation is not purely destructive. In moderate amounts, it can drive important chemical reactions. Far ultraviolet light can break apart simple molecules like carbon dioxide, water, and methane, creating reactive chemical species that can then combine in new ways. This radiation-driven chemistry might actually help synthesize the building blocks of life, including amino acids and nucleotide bases. The challenge for life is to harness the beneficial aspects of radiation while defending against its harmful effects. Life on Earth offers many examples of organisms that have evolved protection against radiation. Bacteria like Deinococcus radiodurans can survive doses of ionizing radiation thousands of times greater than would kill a human. This resistance arises not from any special mechanism to protect DNA, but from extremely efficient DNA repair systems and from cellular mechanisms that protect proteins from radiation-induced damage. When radiation breaks DNA strands, which it does copiously in Deinococcus, the bacterium simply repairs them quickly and accurately. Cyanobacteria living in high-altitude lakes or in desert environments where ultraviolet radiation is intense produce special pigments that absorb ultraviolet light. Cytonin, a brownish-red pigment found in the sheaths of some cyanobacteria, absorbs strongly in the ultraviolet and blue regions of the spectrum, shielding the cells beneath from radiation damage. Mycosporine-like amino acids, another class of ultraviolet-absorbing compounds, are produced by cyanobacteria, algae, and some corals. These molecules act as natural sunscreens, protecting cellular machinery from photo damage. Life on red dwarf planets could evolve similar protective strategies. Organisms on the day side might develop thick protective coatings or shells that block ultraviolet radiation. They might produce their own ultraviolet absorbing pigments, perhaps even more efficient than those found on Earth given the higher radiation environment. The constant exposure to radiation might favor the evolution of extremely robust DNA repair mechanisms, similar to or even surpassing those found in Deinococcus. Another strategy would be behavioral avoidance. Organisms might retreat underground, underwater, or into caves during periods of high radiation. On Earth, endolithic organisms, microbes that live inside rocks, are protected from surface radiation by the rock matrix above them. A red dwarf planet might support extensive endolithic ecosystems, with life colonizing the pore spaces in rocks several meters below the surface. Liquid water can also shield against radiation. Organisms living even a meter underwater would receive significantly reduced ultraviolet doses compared to those on the surface. The timing of flares might also influence life's evolution. If flares are predictable in some way, perhaps occurring at certain phases of stellar magnetic cycles, organisms might evolve the ability to sense approaching flares and take protective action. This could involve detecting increases in radiation at specific wavelengths that precede the main flare emission, or sensing changes in the stellar magnetic field if the organisms have magnetic sensitivity. Alternatively, life might simply accept a higher mutation rate as the cost of living under a flare star. On Earth, mutation is generally harmful, but it is also the raw material of evolution. A higher mutation rate could potentially accelerate evolutionary innovation, allowing populations to adapt more quickly to changing conditions. Of course, this assumes that the beneficial mutations outweigh the harmful ones, which is not guaranteed. There may be an optimal radiation level that maximizes evolutionary adaptation without causing too much damage. For intelligent life attempting to develop technology on a red dwarf planet, stellar flares would present unique challenges. Electronics and communication systems would need to be hardened against electromagnetic pulses and radiation damage. Space-based infrastructure would be particularly vulnerable. On the other hand, a civilization that evolved under such conditions might develop radiation-resistant technologies from the beginning, technologies that could prove valuable for space exploration. The X-ray and extreme ultraviolet radiation from flares affects not just surface life, but also atmospheric chemistry. These high-energy photons can strip electrons from atoms and molecules high in the atmosphere, creating a layer of ionized plasma. This ionosphere reflects radio waves, affecting any radio-based communication. The ionization also drives complex photochemical reactions that could produce or destroy various atmospheric species. One particularly important effect is the potential destruction of ozone. Even if a planet manages to build up an ozone layer through photosynthetic oxygen production, stellar flares could periodically destroy it through photochemical reactions. The ozone layer might fluctuate in thickness in response to flare activity, offering varying levels of protection over time. Life on such a world would need to cope with a changing radiation environment, perhaps developing the ability to rapidly produce protective compounds or to repair radiation damage efficiently. Photosynthesis on Earth relies on the properties of chlorophyll, a pigment that absorbs strongly in the blue and red regions of the visible spectrum while reflecting green light. This gives plants their characteristic green color. The choice of these absorption wavelengths is not arbitrary. It represents an evolutionary optimization based on the spectrum of sunlight that reaches Earth's surface. Under a red dwarf star, the available light is quite different. Red dwarfs emit most of their energy in the red and near-infrared portions of the spectrum, with relatively little blue or green light. A photosynthetic organism using chlorophyll, the primary photosynthetic pigment on Earth, would find itself poorly matched to the available light. The peaks of chlorophyll absorption, around 430 and 660 nanometers, correspond to wavelengths where red dwarfs emit relatively little energy. For a planet around a red dwarf, photosynthetic life would likely need to use different pigments, optimized for the redder light available. On Earth, there is a precedent for this. A cyanobacterium named Acariochlorus marina uses chlorophyll D instead of chlorophyll. A chlorophyll D absorbs light at longer wavelengths, around 710 nanometers, well into the red portion of the spectrum. This demonstrates that life can adapt photosynthesis to different wavelengths when necessary. Acariochlorus thrives in environments where most of the shorter wavelength light has been filtered out by other organisms. Even more intriguingly, some photosynthetic bacteria use bacteria chlorophylls that absorb in the near-infrared at wavelengths up to 1,000 nanometers or longer. These organisms conduct anexogenic photosynthesis, meaning they do not produce oxygen. Instead, they use hydrogen sulfide or other compounds as electron donors. Purple and green sulfur bacteria, which thrive in environments like hydrothermal vents and sulfur-rich lakes, demonstrate that photosynthesis can function at wavelengths far beyond those used by plants. For a planet around a red dwarf, photosynthetic life might need to use even longer wavelengths, pushing into the near-infrared. This presents both opportunities and challenges. Longer wavelength photons carry less energy than shorter wavelength ones. A single photon at 1,000 nanometers has less than half the energy of a photon at 430 nanometers. This means that infrared-based photosynthesis is inherently less energetically favorable than visible light photosynthesis. One solution would be to use multiple photons to drive each photosynthetic reaction. On Earth, photosynthesis uses a two-photon process, with two separate photosystems working in sequence. Each photosystem absorbs a photon to excite an electron, and the two photosystems together generate enough energy to split water and reduce carbon dioxide. For life under a red dwarf, evolution might favor a 3-photon or even 4-photon system, where multiple low-energy photons combine to provide the energy needed for biosynthesis. The color of vegetation on a red dwarf planet has been a subject of scientific speculation. If organisms need to capture as much of the available light as possible, evolutionary pressure could favor pigments that absorb across the entire visible and near-infrared spectrum. This would make them appear black to human eyes, reflecting almost no visible light. However, the actual appearance would depend on many factors, including the star's specific temperature, the planet's atmospheric composition, which filters certain wavelengths, and the evolutionary constraints faced by photosynthetic organisms. Research using models of optimal photosynthetic antenna systems suggests that plants around cooler stars might indeed be darker, but not necessarily black. The models show that the absorption edge, the wavelength at which plants transition from absorbing to reflecting light, shifts toward longer wavelengths for cooler stars. For the coolest red dwarfs, this edge might be in the near-infrared, giving plants a dark red or reddish-black appearance. For slightly warmer red dwarfs, plants might be dark purple, burgundy, or brown. Recent experimental work has shown that Earth cyanobacteria can acclimate to light conditions similar to those around cool red dwarfs. When exposed to light spectra mimicking a 2800 Kelvin star, these cyanobacteria increased their pigment production and maintained normal growth rates. This suggests that oxygenic photosynthesis, the oxygen-producing type of photosynthesis that dominates on Earth, might be viable on red dwarf planets without requiring entirely novel biochemistry. Beyond photosynthesis, chemosynthesis offers an alternative energy source. On Earth, organisms around hydrothermal vents, in deep caves, and beneath the seafloor derive energy from chemical reactions rather than from sunlight. They oxidize reduced compounds like hydrogen sulfide, methane, or ferrous iron, using the released energy to fix carbon dioxide into organic matter. On a tidally locked planet, the night side might be dominated by chemosynthetic ecosystems, with organisms drawing energy from chemicals that accumulate in the absence of sunlight. The atmosphere of a red dwarf planet would also influence the biochemistry of potential life. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane all absorb infrared radiation strongly. A thick atmosphere would filter out much of the near-infrared light before it reaches the surface, potentially making infrared photosynthesis difficult. On the other hand, this same absorption would warm the planet through the greenhouse effect. Life would need to strike a balance, evolving to use whatever wavelengths penetrate most effectively to the surface. Underwater environments present different opportunities. Water absorbs red and infrared light strongly, meaning that only blue and green light penetrate to significant depths in Earth's oceans. Under a red dwarf, where red and infrared light are most abundant, water would absorb most of the available light, even at shallow depths. This might limit photosynthetic life to very shallow waters, or to the very edge of the day-side ocean, where light strikes the water at a glancing angle and doesn't need to penetrate deeply. However, aquatic photosynthetic organisms might evolve to live at the water's surface, forming floating mats or living in the surface microlayer. On Earth, cyanobacteria often form such mats in calm waters. On a red dwarf planet, these surface communities might be even more extensive, perhaps covering much of the day-side ocean. and serving as the primary site of photosynthesis and oxygen production. The oxygen content of the atmosphere would profoundly affect the possibilities for complex life. Oxygen is essential for aerobic respiration, the energy-generating process that powers most complex organisms on Earth. Producing oxygen through photosynthesis requires splitting water molecules, which is energetically expensive. Under a red dwarf's dim light, particularly if photosynthesis must use longer wavelengths, oxygen production might be slower or less efficient than on Earth. This could result in a planet with lower atmospheric oxygen levels, potentially limiting the size and complexity of organisms. Some researchers have suggested that life on red dwarf planets might never evolve oxygenic photosynthesis at all, instead relying on anexogenic photosynthesis supplemented by chemosynthesis. Such an ecosystem would not produce free oxygen, meaning the atmosphere would remain reducing rather than oxidizing. Without oxygen, ozone could not form, offering less protection from stellar ultraviolet radiation. This might confine life to environments shielded by water, rock, or other barriers. Another intriguing possibility involves alternative solvents. While water is the universal solvent for life on Earth, other liquids could potentially support biochemistry under different conditions. Ammonia, methane, and various alcohols remain liquid at temperatures where water would freeze. If a planet in a red dwarf system proved too cold for liquid water despite being in the nominal habitable zone, life might evolve using an alternative solvent. Such life would have radically different biochemistry from Earth life, perhaps operating at fundamentally different temperatures and using different chemical reactions. The stable environment of a tidally locked planet with unchanging light levels and temperature might favor the evolution of highly specialized organisms rather than generalists. On Earth, life must cope with daily and seasonal variations, which often favors organisms that can tolerate a range of conditions. On a tidally locked world, an organism in the terminator zone would always experience the same light level and temperature. Evolution might produce species exquisitely optimized for those exact conditions, but unable to survive even slight variations. The evolution of life on a red dwarf planet would follow pathways shaped by selective pressures, very different from those that shaped terrestrial life. From the moment the first self-replicating molecules assembled, the constraints of the local environment would guide evolutionary innovation. Understanding these pathways requires examining how life might arise, what challenges it would face, and what solutions evolution might craft. The origin of life itself might be influenced by the stellar radiation environment. On Earth, it's hypothesized that ultraviolet light played a role in synthesizing prebiotic organic molecules. The powerful ultraviolet flares from young red dwarfs could drive similar chemistry, creating amino acids, sugars, and nucleotide bases from simpler precursors like water, carbon dioxide, ammonia, and methane. However, if the radiation is too intense, It might break apart complex molecules as quickly as they form, potentially hindering rather than helping abiogenesis. One solution would be for life to originate in a shielded environment. Underwater settings, particularly around hydrothermal vents, offer protection from radiation while providing chemical energy and mineral catalysts. On Earth, there is ongoing debate about whether life began in shallow tidal pools or near deep-sea vents. On a red dwarf planet, the intense surface radiation might shift the balance in favor of deep-water origins. Alternatively, life might begin underground. Subsurface environments on Earth host extensive microbial ecosystems that draw energy from chemical reactions between rocks and fluids. These organisms never see sunlight and are insulated from surface radiation. On a red dwarf planet, subsurface life could potentially persist for billions of years, with some lineages eventually migrating to the surface once photosynthetic organisms had built up an ozone layer. Once life emerged, natural selection would favor organisms best adapted to the local radiation environment. Early organisms would likely be simple, perhaps single-celled, and would need mechanisms to cope with radiation damage. The evolution of efficient DNA repair systems would be crucial. On Earth, all organisms possess multiple DNA repair pathways, but red dwarf life might evolve even more sophisticated systems, capable of fixing hundreds or thousands of DNA breaks quickly and accurately. The evolution of protective pigments would be another early innovation. Organisms that developed molecules capable of absorbing ultraviolet radiation would have a selective advantage, as they would sustain less DNA damage than unprotected competitors. Over time, these pigments might become more efficient and more diverse, with different pigments protecting against different wavelengths of radiation. The exteriors of organisms might become layered with various protective compounds, each optimized for a specific portion of the spectrum. Radiation-resistant organisms on Earth often produce antioxidants and other compounds that neutralize reactive oxygen species produced by radiation. Radiation damages cells not only by directly breaking chemical bonds, but also by generating free radicals, highly reactive molecules that cause secondary damage. Life on red dwarf planets would likely evolve elaborate systems of antioxidants, similar to, but perhaps more extensive than those found in terrestrial extremophiles. As life diversified, the three major zones of a tidally locked planet, day side, night side, and terminator, would likely host distinct evolutionary lineages. Day side organisms would evolve under intense, constant radiation. They might develop reflective surfaces to reduce heat and light absorption, or they might live primarily underground, emerging only briefly or living in the pore spaces of rocks. Photoautotrophs, organisms that harvest light for energy, would dominate where light is available, but they would need robust protection. Night-side organisms would face a different set of challenges. In the absence of light, they would need alternative energy sources. Chemosynthetic bacteria, similar to those around Earth's hydrothermal vents, might form the base of night-side food webs. These organisms would oxidize reduced chemicals, perhaps hydrogen sulfide from volcanic activity, or ferrous iron from weathering rocks, or methane seeping from the planet's interior. Alternatively, night-side ecosystems might depend on organic material produced on the day side and transported by winds or ocean currents. The terminator zone, with its moderate light levels and stable conditions, might see the greatest diversity and biomass. Here, conditions would be most Earth-like, neither too bright nor too dark, neither too hot nor too cold. Photosynthetic organisms could thrive without needing extreme radiation protection, while chemosynthetic organisms could also survive by exploiting chemical gradients between the day and night sides. The terminator might function as the planet's primary ecological hub, with organisms from this region sometimes dispersing toward the day or night sides. Over millions of years, these distinct populations might diverge into separate species, or even separate domains of life. Gene flow between zones would be limited if organisms adapted to one zone cannot survive in the others. Day-side organisms adapted to intense light might find the terminator too dim, while terminator organisms might suffer damage on the day side. This geographic isolation could drive speciation much, as island isolation drives diversification on Earth. Multicellular life, if it evolved, would require mechanisms to coordinate cellular activities across larger spatial scales. On Earth, multicellularity evolved multiple times independently in animals, plants, fungi, and several groups of algae. The transition requires cells to stick together and communicate, and it offers advantages like larger size, cellular specialization, and the ability to exploit new ecological niches. On a red dwarf planet, multicellularity might similarly prove advantageous, but the forms it takes could be quite different. For instance, multicellular organisms on the day side might develop layered structures, with protective outer cells shielding delicate inner cells from radiation. These outer cells might be packed with ultraviolet absorbing pigments and might be considered expendable, regularly dying and being replaced while protecting the organism's vital internal tissues. The organism might resemble a biological suit of armor, with a thick, hardened exterior and soft, metabolically active interior. On the night side, if life exists at all, it might remain primarily microbial, or it might develop into forms unlike anything on Earth. Without light to harvest, there would be less energy available to support complex food webs. Large organisms require substantial energy inputs, which photosynthesis provides very efficiently. Chemosynthesis is generally less productive, though hydrothermal vent communities on Earth show that it can support dense populations in localized areas. The terminator zone offers the most promising conditions for complex multicellular life. Here, photosynthetic primary producers could support herbivores, which in turn support predators, creating multi-trophic ecosystems similar to those on Earth. The organisms might look strange to our eyes, with coloration adapted to the red light, and perhaps structures optimized for the constant wind patterns of a tidally locked world. One intriguing possibility is that life might evolve different forms of mobility in response to the fixed illumination patterns. On Earth, many organisms are sessile, rooted in one place, because conditions vary over time in ways that make movement unnecessary or inefficient. On a tidally locked planet, conditions might vary more in space than in time. Mobile organisms could move toward the terminator when conditions on the day side become too harsh, then return when flares subside. This migration would require sophisticated navigation abilities, perhaps using the position of the star or the strength of stellar radiation as cues. The structure of ecosystems on a tidally locked planet would reflect the unique distribution of energy and resources across the planetary surface. On Earth, solar energy arrives more or less uniformly, with variations based on latitude, weather, and time of day. On a tidally locked world, energy distribution would be fundamentally different, concentrated on the day side and absent on the night side. This asymmetry would shape every aspect of ecological organization. On the day side, based on what we understand about photosynthetic ecosystems, organisms forming the base of the food web would likely occupy regions where light is most intense and consistent. If photosynthesis proves efficient under red dwarf light conditions, as Earth cyanobacteria experiments suggest it can be, the day side could potentially support productive ecosystems. If efficiency is limited by the longer wavelengths, productivity might be constrained, resulting in sparser populations and simpler food webs. We might envision extensive zones of dark pigmented vegetation covering portions of the day side, perhaps concentrated around the substellar point where light is most intense. These organisms could have broad, flat surfaces to maximize light capture, or they might grow in dense vertical stands, competing for access to the stellar radiation. Their pigmentation, based on optimal absorption models, could range from deep purple to nearly black, absorbing across a broad spectrum to capture every available photon. Alternatively, photosynthetic life might prefer aquatic environments. Floating mats of cyanobacteria or algae could cover the day side ocean, forming a living layer at the air-water interface. These mats would be continually bathed in starlight, producing oxygen and organic matter that would then sink to support deeper ecosystems. The ocean beneath might teem with filter feeders and scavengers, consuming this organic rain. Much as deep-sea communities on Earth depend on material sinking from the sunlit surface, herbivores would evolve to consume the photosynthetic organisms, developing mouthparts, digestive systems, and behaviors suited to their particular food sources. These herbivores might themselves become food for predators, creating multi-level trophic structures. However, the constant daylight would mean that predator-prey interactions would not be mediated by a day-night cycle as they are on Earth, where many predators hunt at dawn or dusk, and many prey species are most active during particular times of day. The Terminator Zone presents unique ecological opportunities. Here, organisms could exploit both light-based and chemical-based energy sources. Photosynthetic organisms adapted to low light levels could thrive, perhaps joined by chemosynthetic bacteria, oxidizing compounds carried by winds from the night side. The mix of energy sources might support particularly diverse communities, with organisms filling niches that would be impossible on either the day or night side alone. Temperature gradients in the Terminator Zone might create distinct microclimates over relatively short distances. Moving from the day side toward the Terminator, temperatures would gradually decrease, and organisms adapted to each temperature range would sort themselves accordingly. This zonation would be visible as bands of different colored vegetation or different community compositions, each band optimized for its specific conditions. Water availability would also vary across the Terminator. On the day side, high temperatures would increase evaporation, potentially leaving some areas dry despite being within the nominal habitable zone. Water vapor would be carried by winds toward the cooler night side, where it might condense and precipitate. The result could be a hydrological cycle where water evaporates on the day side, moves through the Terminator, and rains out on the night side, then returns to the day side as liquid water flowing through rivers or underground aquifers. This water cycle would be crucial for redistributing nutrients and organic matter. Minerals weathered from rocks on the day side could be carried in solution to the Terminator and night side. Organic matter produced by photosynthesis on the day side could similarly be transported, providing energy for ecosystems far from where it was produced. Rivers flowing through the Terminator might support riparian ecosystems, linear oases where water and nutrients concentrate. On the night side, ecosystems would be fundamentally different. Without light, primary production would have to rely on chemosynthesis. If the planet has active geology, hydrothermal vents might dot the night-side ocean floor, each supporting a community of organisms that draw energy from the chemicals released by the vents. These communities might be quite localized, each vent system forming an isolated ecosystem with little connection to others. Alternatively, if the night side has extensive ice sheets, life might exist beneath the ice in the liquid water ocean below. On Earth, Lake Vostok in Antarctica sits beneath several kilometers of ice, completely cut off from sunlight. Yet simulations suggest that microbes could survive in such environments, drawing energy from chemical reactions between the water and the bedrock below. A red dwarf planet's night side might host an entire hidden biosphere beneath kilometers of ice. unknown to any day-side organisms, and completely isolated from them. The biomass distribution on a tidally locked planet would be highly asymmetric. The day side and terminator would contain most of the planet's living matter, with the night side containing far less. This contrasts sharply with Earth, where biomass is more evenly distributed globally, with local variations based on climate and nutrient availability. A red dwarf planet might have enormous regions of its surface that are essentially biological deserts, devoid of life, or hosting only sparse microbial populations. This asymmetry would affect biogeochemical cycles as well. On Earth, the carbon cycle involves the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere, oceans, land, and living organisms, with processes like photosynthesis and respiration occurring globally. On a tidally locked planet, photosynthesis would be concentrated on one hemisphere, while respiration and decomposition would occur more evenly. This might lead to chemical gradients in the atmosphere, with oxygen being produced primarily on the day side and consumed everywhere, potentially resulting in an oxygen concentration that varies with location. The nitrogen cycle, crucial for building amino acids and nucleotides, might also show spatial variation. On Earth, nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms usable by other organisms, and denitrifying bacteria return nitrogen to the atmosphere. On a red dwarf planet, these processes might be spatially separated, with fixing occurring predominantly in high-energy day-side environments and denitrification occurring on the night side or in low-oxygen environments. Seasonal variations, absent in the temporal sense, might appear in spatial patterns. Stellar flare activity could vary over weeks or months, creating quasi-seasonal periods of high and low radiation. During high flare periods, day-side organisms might retreat or go dormant, while during calm periods, they might actively grow and reproduce. These cycles would not affect all parts of the planet equally. The substellar point would experience the full intensity of flares, while regions near the terminator might be partially shielded by atmospheric absorption. If the planet has moons, tidal effects from these moons could create additional cycles. On Earth, tides are driven primarily by the moon's gravity. On a red dwarf planet, a moon would create tides in the oceans, even though the planet itself is tidally locked to its star. These tides would have different periodicities depending on the moon's orbital period, potentially creating tidal zones where organisms would need to cope with periodic inundation and exposure, much as intertidal organisms do on Earth. The atmosphere of a red dwarf planet serves not just as a reservoir of gases for respiration and photosynthesis, but as a crucial shield protecting the surface from the star's radiation and maintaining temperate conditions. The composition, thickness, and dynamics of this atmosphere would profoundly affect the planet's habitability and the evolution of any life it hosts. For a planet to retain an atmosphere over billions of years, it must have sufficient mass and gravity to hold onto its gases. Lightweight gases like hydrogen and helium escape easily from Earth-sized planets, which is why Earth's atmosphere is dominated by heavier molecules like nitrogen and oxygen. On a red dwarf planet, atmospheric retention faces an additional challenge. The planet's proximity to its star places it in a region of intense stellar wind and flare activity that can strip away atmospheric gases. Atmospheric erosion occurs when high-energy radiation ionizes atmospheric molecules, giving them an electrical charge. The stellar wind, a stream of charged particles flowing outward from the star, can then drag these ionized molecules away from the planet. Over millions of years, this process can remove substantial amounts of atmosphere, potentially transforming a habitable world into a barren rock. Young red dwarfs, with their intense flare activity, pose the greatest risk during this early violent period. However, not all atmospheres are equally vulnerable. A planet with a strong magnetic field can deflect much of the stellar wind, protecting the atmosphere. The magnetic field creates a magnetosphere, a region around the planet where the field lines shield against incoming charged particles. Earth's magnetosphere protects our atmosphere from solar wind erosion, and a similar field on a red dwarf planet would provide comparable protection. The challenge is that tidally locked planets might have weaker magnetic fields due to their slow rotation. Earth's magnetic field is generated by convective motion in the liquid outer core, driven by the planet's rotation, and by heat flow from the core to the mantle. A tidally locked planet rotating once per orbit, every few days or weeks, has less rotational energy to drive this dynamo. However, theoretical models suggest that even slowly rotating planets can maintain significant magnetic fields if their interiors remain hot and convective. Alternatively, a planet might protect its atmosphere through sheer abundance. If the planet formed with a very thick atmosphere, perhaps hundreds of times thicker than Earth's, it might lose atmospheric material to space while still retaining enough for habitability. Over the billions of years of a red dwarf's active youth, the atmosphere might thin considerably. But if the planet started with enough, some would remain even after substantial erosion. Water loss is a particular concern. Water molecules in the upper atmosphere can be split by ultraviolet radiation into hydrogen and oxygen. The lightweight hydrogen escapes to space easily, while the oxygen either escapes more slowly or reacts with surface rocks. This process can desiccate a planet over geological time. For a planet in the habitable zone of a young red dwarf, the star's extreme ultraviolet output might cause rapid water loss, potentially creating a dry, Venus-like world, even if the planet originally possessed substantial oceans. One potential savior is atmospheric hydrogen. If the planet has significant hydrogen gas in its upper atmosphere. This hydrogen can absorb incoming ultraviolet radiation before it reaches water vapor molecules, effectively shielding the water from photodissociation. The hydrogen itself may be lost to space, but it acts as a sacrificial layer, protecting the water beneath. A planet that experiences significant water loss early in its history might establish an equilibrium where water loss slows once the hydrogen layer forms. The composition of the atmosphere would also affect the planet's climate. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor trap infrared radiation, warming the planet's surface. On a red dwarf planet, especially one in the outer reaches of the habitable zone, greenhouse warming might be essential to maintain liquid water. A thick carbon dioxide atmosphere, similar to Venus, but at a more temperate temperature, could provide the necessary warming. However, too much greenhouse effect could be problematic. If the day side becomes too hot, water would evaporate extensively, and the resulting water vapor would itself be a powerful greenhouse gas, leading to a runaway greenhouse effect. The planet would heat further, more water would evaporate, and eventually all surface water might boil away, leaving the planet uninhabitable. Finding the right balance of greenhouse gases is crucial. Cloud formation plays a critical role in regulating temperature. On the day side, particularly at the substellar point, intense heating would drive strong convection, creating towering clouds. These clouds would reflect a significant fraction of incoming starlight back into space, cooling the surface. This negative feedback mechanism helps prevent runaway heating and extends the inner edge of the habitable zone farther inward than simple calculations would suggest. The presence of dust in the atmosphere could also influence habitability. Mineral dust, lifted by winds, would absorb and scatter light, affecting both the amount of light reaching the surface and the radiation balance of the atmosphere. Recent research suggests that dust in the atmosphere of a tidally locked planet could cool the day side and warm the night side, reducing temperature extremes and potentially expanding the habitable area. The dust would act as tiny radiators, absorbing heat on the day side and re-emitting it as infrared radiation that could reach the night side. Atmospheric circulation would be dominated by the temperature difference between day and night sides. Air heated on the day side would rise and flow toward the night side at high altitude, then cool, descend, and return to the day side at low altitude. This circulation would transport not just heat, but also water vapor, dust, and any airborne organisms. The jet streams on such a planet would be powerful and persistent, potentially much stronger than Earth's jet streams. For flying organisms, if they evolved, these winds would be both a challenge and an opportunity. Flying against the wind from the night side to the day side would be difficult, but flying with the wind in the opposite direction would be easy. Organisms might evolve migration patterns that take advantage of these prevailing winds, perhaps riding high-altitude winds toward the night side and returning at lower altitudes where winds are weaker. The atmospheric pressure at the surface would also matter. Higher pressure generally favors habitability by allowing liquid water to exist over a wider temperature range, and by providing more molecules to absorb and redistribute heat. However, too much pressure could make an atmosphere opaque, blocking light from reaching the surface and preventing photosynthesis. The optimal pressure would depend on the specific composition and the distance from the star. Some researchers have proposed that a planet might have regions of dramatically different atmospheric composition. The day side might have an oxygen-rich atmosphere if photosynthesis is active, while the night side might have a more reducing atmosphere with higher concentrations of hydrogen and methane. Chemical reactions at the terminator would mediate between these two atmospheric regimes. Such spatial variation in atmospheric chemistry would create complex environmental gradients that life would need to navigate. Proxima Centauri, the closest star to our solar system at just over 4 light-years away, has become one of the most studied red dwarfs precisely because of its proximity. In 2016, astronomers announced the discovery of Proxima Centauri b, a planet orbiting within the star's habitable zone with a minimum mass of at least 1.06 times that of Earth. This discovery electrified the astrobiology community, as it meant that the nearest potentially habitable world was quite literally in our cosmic backyard. Proxima b orbits its star every 11.2 days at a distance of approximately 0.05 astronomical units, about 1/20th the distance between Earth and the Sun. This places it well within the habitable zone, though whether it actually harbors liquid water remains uncertain. The planet receives roughly the same amount of stellar energy as Earth receives from the Sun, though the composition of that energy is quite different, weighted heavily toward the red and infrared. Proxima Centauri itself is a flare star, and observations have recorded numerous powerful flares during which the star's ultraviolet and X-ray output increases dramatically. In March 2016, shortly before Proxima b's discovery was announced, the star underwent a superflare that increased its brightness by a factor of 68 over 10.3 seconds. Such events pose significant challenges for any atmosphere or life on Proxima. The planet likely faces a constant bombardment of stellar radiation, interspersed with these violent outbursts. Whether Proxima b is tidally locked remains a subject of investigation. Given its orbital period and proximity to the star, tidal locking is probable, but not certain. If it has a thick atmosphere, as discussed earlier, atmospheric tides might keep the planet rotating slowly. If it lacks a substantial atmosphere, it almost certainly presents the same face to Proxima Centauri at all times, creating the permanent day and night sides we have explored. In 2020, astronomers announced possible evidence for a second planet in the Proxima Centauri system, designated Proxima c. This candidate planet orbits much farther from the star, well outside the habitable zone, and would be far too cold for liquid water. Its existence remains to be confirmed, but if real, it demonstrates that even small red dwarf systems can host multiple planets. The TRAPPIST-1 system represents perhaps the most exciting discovery in red dwarf planetary science. Located approximately 40 light-years from Earth, TRAPPIST-1 is an ultra-cool red dwarf, even smaller and cooler than Proxima Centauri. It hosts at least 7 known planets, all roughly Earth-sized, making it the most populous system of terrestrial planets yet discovered. 3 of these planets, designated TRAPPIST-1 E, F, and G, orbit within or near the habitable zone. The TRAPPIST-1 planets are packed tightly around their star. All 7 orbit closer than Mercury orbits our Sun, with the outermost planet completing its orbit in just over 18 days. The planets are so close together that an observer on one planet would see the others as large disks in the sky, bigger than the Moon appears from Earth. Gravitational interactions between the planets have locked them into orbital resonances, meaning their orbital periods are related by simple integer ratios. These resonances have allowed astronomers to determine the masses and radii of the TRAPPIST-1 planets with remarkable precision. Combined mass and radius measurements reveal that all 7 planets have densities consistent with rocky compositions, though some may have significant water content. TRAPPIST-1e, in particular, appears to be very similar to Earth in size and density, and it receives about the same amount of stellar energy as Earth does from the Sun. Observations using the Hubble Space Telescope and other instruments have attempted to characterize the atmospheres of the TRAPPIST-1 planets. The results have been somewhat disappointing for astrobiologists. Several of the inner planets show no evidence of hydrogen-rich atmospheres, suggesting they may have lost significant atmospheric mass to stellar wind stripping during the star's early active phase. However, this does not rule out the presence of heavier, more tightly bound atmospheres composed of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, or other molecules. The James Webb Space Telescope has begun detailed observations of the TRAPPIST-1 system, and its infrared capabilities are well suited to studying planets around cool stars. Early results have provided tantalizing hints about atmospheric composition, though definitive detection of biosignatures remains elusive. The coming years will see intensive study of these worlds, searching for signs of water vapor, oxygen, methane, and other molecules that might indicate habitability or even life. Another intriguing system is LHS 1140, a red dwarf located about 41 light-years away. It hosts at least 2 known planets, with LHS 1140 be orbiting within the habitable zone. This planet is significantly more massive than Earth, about 6.6 Earth masses, placing it in the category of super-Earths. Its size and mass suggest it could be either a rocky planet with a thick atmosphere or a water world with a deep global ocean. Observations of LHS 1140 be have detected a possible atmosphere, though its composition remains unclear. The planet's orbital period of 25 days places it in an interesting position. It receives less stellar radiation than Earth, suggesting it might be at the outer edge of the habitable zone. If it has a substantial atmosphere with greenhouse gases, it could maintain temperate surface conditions. If not, it might be too cold for liquid water, except perhaps in equatorial regions or at depth. Ross 128b, discovered in 2017, orbits a red dwarf star 11 light-years from Earth. This planet has a minimum mass of about 1.4 Earth masses and orbits in the inner edge of its star's habitable zone. What makes Ross 128b particularly interesting is that its host star is remarkably quiet. Unlike Proxima Centauri or TRAPPIST-1, Ross 128 shows minimal flare activity, making it one of the least active red dwarfs known. This quiescence might make Ross 128 be more hospitable to life, as the planet would experience fewer radiation storms. Kepler 186f, discovered by the Kepler Space Telescope, was the first Earth-sized planet found orbiting in the habitable zone of another star. Its host is a cool red dwarf, and Kepler 186f orbits at the outer edge of the habitable zone, receiving about 1/3 the light that Earth receives from the Sun. The planet is about 10% larger than Earth, and while its mass remains unknown, it is likely rocky. Its orbital period is 130 days, longer than most habitable zone red dwarf planets. The existence of Kepler 186f demonstrates that not all habitable zone red dwarf planets orbit extremely close to their stars. At its distance, Kepler 186f might not be fully tidally locked, or its locking might have occurred more slowly, potentially allowing it to retain volatiles and develop a more Earth-like environment. However, the lower stellar radiation it receives means it would need a substantial greenhouse effect to maintain liquid water. GJ 667 CC orbits a red dwarf in a triple star system 33 light-years from Earth, with a minimum mass of about 3.8 Earth masses. It is a super-Earth orbiting in the habitable zone with a period of 28 days. The presence of 2 additional stars in the system, both more massive than GJ 667c, adds complexity to the environment. These stars orbit at a distance, but they would be visible in the sky of GJ 667cc, perhaps providing additional light and affecting the planet's radiation environment. Teegarden star, one of the closest red dwarfs at just 12 light-years away, hosts at least 2 planets in its habitable zone. Teegarden B and Teegarden C have minimum masses of 1.1 and 1.3 Earth masses, respectively. Their proximity to Earth makes them attractive targets for future study, particularly with next-generation telescopes that might be able to directly image exoplanets, or characterize their atmospheres in detail. All of these systems provide natural laboratories for studying the potential for life around red dwarfs. Each has unique characteristics, different stellar activity levels, different planetary sizes and compositions, different orbital configurations. By studying this diversity, astronomers hope to determine which factors are most important for habitability, and to estimate how many truly Earth-like worlds exist in our galactic neighborhood. The transition from single-celled to multicellular life represents one of the most significant evolutionary innovations in Earth's history. This transition occurred independently multiple times on Earth in animals, plants, fungi, and various algal lineages. Each occurrence required cells to cooperate, adhere to each other, and differentiate into specialized types. On a red dwarf planet, would similar transitions occur? And if so, what forms might multicellular life take? The advantages of multicellularity are well established on Earth. Larger size offers protection from predation, allows organisms to exploit new ecological niches, and enables greater complexity through cellular specialization. A multicellular organism can have cells dedicated to different functions, some for structure and support, others for nutrient absorption, others for reproduction. This division of labor allows each cell type to become highly efficient at its particular role. On a tidally locked red dwarf planet, multicellular life would need to cope with the same challenges that single-celled life faces: radiation, unusual light conditions, and possibly strong winds or ocean currents. However, being larger would offer some advantages. A multicellular organism could develop a protective outer layer of cells that shields internal tissues from radiation, something a single cell cannot do. On the day side, we might imagine organisms with thick, heavily pigmented outer layers. These outer cells would be packed with ultraviolet absorbing compounds and might contain reflective structures that bounce harmful radiation away before it can penetrate deeply. Beneath this protective coat, photosynthetic cells could harvest the filtered light, while inner cells handle metabolism, storage, and reproduction. Such organisms might resemble living fortresses, with their soft, vulnerable parts hidden inside tough, radiation-resistant exteriors. On Earth, organisms in harsh environments often show similar strategies. Desert plants have thick cuticles to prevent water loss. Deep-sea organisms have protective coverings that withstand extreme pressure. Red dwarf planet life would adapt its outer layers to withstand extreme radiation. The shape and structure of multicellular organisms would also be influenced by the local conditions. In areas of strong, persistent winds, organisms might be streamlined to reduce drag, or they might be low to the ground to minimize wind stress. Alternatively, they might anchor themselves firmly and develop flexible structures that bend with the wind rather than resisting it. On Earth, trees and plants in windy environments show both strategies. Some are stunted and low. Others are flexible and sway. In aquatic environments, the constraints would be different. Buoyancy would allow organisms to grow larger than on land without needing structural support against gravity. Free-floating organisms might drift with ocean currents, harvesting light in the day-side waters, and perhaps moving toward the terminator or night side at different life stages. Anchored organisms might grow in dense stands where light penetrates, forming underwater forests or meadows. Evolution of animal-like organisms, mobile heterotrophs that consume other organisms for energy, would depend on the productivity of the photosynthetic base of the food web. On Earth, animals require substantial energy inputs, which the high productivity of oxygenic photosynthesis provides. On a red dwarf planet, if photosynthesis is less efficient due to the redder light, the total productivity might be lower, potentially limiting the size and complexity of animal-like organisms. However, if photosynthetic efficiency proves comparable to Earth's, there is no fundamental reason why complex animals could not evolve. These animals would need sensory systems adapted to the local conditions, which we will explore shortly. They would need ways to move, to find food, to avoid predators, and to reproduce. All of these functions could evolve under red dwarf light, though the specific mechanisms might differ from Earth life. Body plans might be influenced by the constant environmental conditions in a given location. On Earth, many body plans are adaptations to cope with varying conditions. Warm-blooded animals maintain constant body temperature despite external variations. Deciduous trees lose leaves in winter. Annual plants survive adverse seasons as seeds. On a tidally locked planet, where conditions at a given location remain constant, such adaptations might be unnecessary. Instead, organisms might be exquisitely specialized for their specific locations. An organism in the substellar point region would be adapted to intense, constant light and possibly high temperatures, but it might be unable to survive even slight reductions in light or temperature. This specialization could lead to high local diversity, with different species filling very narrow niches. But it might also make organisms vulnerable to any changes, such as variations in stellar output or shifts in atmospheric circulation patterns. Reproduction in multicellular organisms could take many forms. Sexual reproduction, which dominates complex life on Earth, offers the advantage of genetic recombination, creating offspring with new combinations of traits. This genetic diversity helps populations adapt to changing conditions. On a red dwarf planet, where local conditions are stable, asexual reproduction might be more common, as the benefits of genetic diversity are reduced when conditions do not vary. However, if stellar flares create periodic variations in radiation, or if climate patterns shift over longer time scales, sexual reproduction might still prove advantageous. Populations with higher genetic diversity would be more likely to include some individuals capable of tolerating the new conditions, allowing the population to survive and adapt. The frequency and intensity of flares might thus influence the evolution of reproductive strategies. Life cycles could also be influenced by environmental conditions. On Earth, many organisms have complex life cycles with multiple stages adapted to different environments or seasons. Amphibians have aquatic larvae and terrestrial adults. Insects undergo metamorphosis, with larvae and adults often eating different foods and living in different places. On a red dwarf planet, similar life cycle complexity might evolve, with different life stages adapted to different zones of the planet. For example, an organism might begin life in the terminator zone, where conditions are moderate. As it grows, it might migrate toward the day side, developing thicker protective layers and more efficient light harvesting abilities. Reproduction might occur in a specific zone, perhaps in the cooler waters of the night side ocean, where developing embryos would be protected from day side radiation. Such complex life cycles would require sophisticated navigation and physiological flexibility. Social behavior and cooperation could also evolve, particularly if environmental challenges are severe. On Earth, social organisms, from ants to humans, achieve through cooperation what individuals cannot accomplish alone. On a red dwarf planet, cooperation might allow organisms to construct protective structures, pool resources during flares, or migrate collectively between zones. The specific forms of social organization would depend on the ecological context. But the basic principle that cooperation can be advantageous would apply. Intelligence, should it evolve, would be shaped by the sensory environment and the challenges organisms face. An intelligent species on a red dwarf planet might have different priorities than humans. If stellar flares are a constant threat, intelligence might focus on predicting flares and organizing group responses. If resources are concentrated in specific zones, intelligence might aid in navigating to those zones or in competing for access to them. Sensory systems evolve to detect stimuli relevant to an organism's survival. On Earth, vision evolved multiple times independently because light is abundant and carries information about the environment. Under a red dwarf star, vision would still be useful, but the specific wavelengths organisms could see might be quite different from what humans perceive. On Earth, human vision covers the range from about 380 nanometers in the violet to about 700 nanometers in the deep red. This range corresponds roughly to the peak output of the sun's spectrum, a match that arose through millions of years of evolution. Red dwarfs emit relatively little violet or blue light, but substantial red and near-infrared radiation, drawing from our understanding of how visual systems adapt to available light. We can infer that an organism evolving under such conditions could develop visual pigments that respond to longer wavelengths, perhaps extending into the near-infrared. On Earth, some animals already see into the near-infrared. Certain snakes, like pit vipers, have infrared sensing organs that allow them to detect the heat radiation from warm-bodied prey. However, these are thermal sensors rather than eyes. They detect heat rather than reflected light. True vision in the infrared, using reflected starlight, would require photoreceptor cells with pigments that absorb and respond to longer wavelengths than the visual pigments on Earth. Rhodopsins, the proteins that detect light in animal eyes, can be tuned to respond to different wavelengths by changing specific amino acids in the protein. On Earth, rhodopsins typically respond to wavelengths between 400 and 600 nanometers, but there is no fundamental reason they could not be tuned to longer wavelengths. Evolution on a red dwarf planet might produce rhodopsins that respond to light at 700, 800, or even 1,000 nanometers. The result would be a visual system that sees what we would consider infrared as visible light. To such an organism, the red dwarf star would appear bright. The landscape would be illuminated in what we would call infrared, and what we see as red might appear to them as we see blue appears to us. A short wavelength color at the edge of their visible range. Color vision offers advantages by allowing organisms to distinguish objects based on their spectral properties. On Earth, color vision helps animals find ripe fruit, identify mates, and detect predators against complex backgrounds. On a red dwarf planet, color vision might evolve to distinguish between different types of photosynthetic organisms, each absorbing slightly different wavelengths, or to detect the spectral signatures of different minerals or water sources. However, with limited spectral range in the starlight, color vision might be less useful than on Earth. Red dwarfs emit most of their light in a narrow range of wavelengths. There might not be much blue or green light to distinguish from red, reducing the information content that color vision could provide. Organisms might instead rely more heavily on intensity, polarization, or temporal patterns in the light. Polarization vision, the ability to detect the orientation of light waves, is used by many Earth animals, including bees, ants, and some fish and birds. Polarized light can reveal information about surfaces, water bodies, and sky position, even when direct sun is not visible. On a tidally locked planet, where the sun never moves in the sky, polarization patterns would be static at any given location, but would vary with position on the planet. Organisms might use polarization as a navigational aid when moving between zones. Temporal patterns in light intensity could be important if stellar flares are frequent. An organism might evolve the ability to detect the rapid brightening that precedes a major flare, allowing it to take protective action. This would require very fast visual responses, faster than human vision, to detect changes on time scales of seconds or less. Such rapid vision exists on Earth in organisms like flies, which can perceive flickers of light much faster than humans can. Beyond vision, other sensory modalities would be crucial. Chemoreception, the detection of chemical compounds, would allow organisms to sense food, toxins, mates, and other important chemical signals in their environment. On Earth, smell, and taste are both forms of chemoreception. On a red dwarf planet, chemoreception might be even more important than on Earth, particularly on the night side where vision is limited. The atmosphere's chemical gradients between day and night sides might create a form of chemical landscape that organisms could sense and navigate. An organism moving from the day side toward the terminator might detect increasing concentrations of certain gases, using these as cues for navigation. In aquatic environments, chemical plumes from hydrothermal vents or from decomposing organic matter would provide information about resource locations. Thermoreception, the sensing of temperature, would be important for organisms navigating the temperature gradients on a tidally locked planet. Moving toward the day side, temperatures increase. Moving toward the night side, they decrease. An organism with sophisticated thermoreceptors could navigate by temperature alone, moving toward preferred thermal environments or avoiding dangerously hot or cold areas. Mechanoreception, the detection of physical forces like pressure, touch, and vibration, would function similarly to on Earth. In the strong winds of a tidally locked planet, mechanoreceptors might be particularly important for sensing wind speed and direction, allowing organisms to orient themselves or to find shelter. In aquatic environments, mechanoreceptors could detect water currents or the vibrations caused by other organisms. Electroreception, the ability to detect electric fields, is used by some Earth animals, notably certain fish like sharks and rays. On a red dwarf planet, if the star's magnetic activity creates strong variations in the planetary magnetic field, organisms might evolve electroreception to detect these variations, possibly using them as a warning system for approaching flares. The intense electromagnetic pulses from flares would create detectable electric field changes. Magnetoreception, the detection of magnetic fields, is used by many migratory Earth animals for navigation. Birds, turtles, and some bacteria can sense Earth's magnetic field and use it to orient themselves. On a red dwarf planet, magnetoreception could serve similar functions, helping organisms navigate between zones or return to specific locations after migration. If the planet has a strong magnetic field, this sense might be even more developed than on Earth. Auditory systems, detecting sound waves, would work essentially the same as on Earth, though the specific sounds in the environment might differ. The constant winds of a tidally locked planet would create persistent background noise, and organisms might evolve to filter out this noise while remaining sensitive to biologically relevant sounds like predator movements or mating calls. In aquatic environments, sound travels efficiently, and aquatic organisms might rely heavily on echolocation or communication through sound. The integration of these various sensory inputs would create an organism's perceptual world. On a red dwarf planet, that world would be fundamentally different from the human perceptual world. The star would be a constant presence in one part of the sky, never moving. The light would be deep red or infrared, painting the landscape in hues we cannot imagine. The air would flow in persistent patterns, carrying chemical signals and thermal information. The sky might show auroras, particularly on the night side, and stellar flares would periodically flood the environment with radiation across all sensory modalities, brightening the sky, heating the air, creating electromagnetic pulses, and altering atmospheric chemistry. Communication allows organisms to exchange information, coordinate activities, attract mates, warn of danger, and establish social hierarchies. On Earth, communication takes many forms: visual displays, sounds, chemical signals, tactile interactions, and even electrical signals in some aquatic species. On a red dwarf planet, communication would evolve to suit the local sensory environment and the challenges organisms face. Visual communication under red light would differ from visual communication under white light. Colors that contrast strongly to human eyes might not contrast at all under a red dwarf spectrum. An organism displaying colors to attract mates or warn competitors would need to use colors that differ in reflectivity at the wavelengths where red dwarfs emit strongly. This might favor patterns based on brightness contrast rather than hue contrast. Bioluminescence, the production of light by living organisms, is common on Earth in deep-sea environments where sunlight does not penetrate. Organisms produce light through chemical reactions, using it to attract prey, find mates, or communicate. On the night side of a tidally locked red dwarf planet, bioluminescence might be even more important, as it could be the only local light source aside from starlight. Organisms on the night side might evolve elaborate bioluminescent displays, creating light shows that serve social and ecological functions. These displays might occur at specific wavelengths, chosen to maximize visibility against the dark background. On Earth, bioluminescence typically produces blue or green light because these wavelengths travel well through water. On a red dwarf planet's night side, organisms might produce red or infrared bioluminescence, if that is what their visual systems detect best. Acoustic communication using sound would not be significantly affected by the stellar spectrum. Sound travels through air and water regardless of light conditions, making it a reliable communication channel on both day and night sides. However, the constant wind noise on a tidally locked planet might interfere with acoustic signals, particularly on the day side, where convection is strongest. Organisms might evolve to communicate using sounds that cut through the background wind noise. High-frequency sounds, ultrasonic to human ears, might work well because wind noise is typically stronger at lower frequencies. Alternatively, organisms might use temporal patterns, brief pulses, or specific rhythms that are distinguishable from continuous noise. Infrasound, frequencies below human hearing, could also be effective, traveling long distances through the atmosphere. Chemical communication, using pheromones or other scent molecules, would be strongly affected by atmospheric circulation. On a tidally locked planet, Winds blow consistently from the day side toward the night side at the surface level. An organism releasing pheromones would need to account for these winds. Potential receivers downwind could detect the chemicals easily, but receivers upwind would not. This directionality might influence where organisms position themselves for mating or other social activities. Animals might aggregate in specific zones where wind patterns create favorable conditions for chemical communication. Alternatively, they might time their chemical signaling to coincide with periods of calmer winds, if such periods exist during lulls in stellar activity. In aquatic environments, chemical signals would disperse through water currents. Ocean circulation on a tidally locked planet would have its own persistent patterns, and organisms would adapt their chemical signaling to these currents. Bottom-dwelling organisms might release chemicals that sink and spread along the seafloor, while pelagic organisms might release chemicals that disperse in surface waters. Tactile communication using touch requires close proximity and works similarly regardless of the stellar environment. However, the social contexts in which touch occurs might differ. On Earth, touch communicates bonding, dominance, grooming, and mating intent. On a red dwarf planet, touch might also communicate information about environmental conditions, with organisms that have recently returned from hazardous day-side conditions, transferring information to colony members through tactile signals. Electrical communication, used by some earthfish, involves generating electrical fields and detecting distortions in those fields caused by objects or other organisms. This works well in water, but not in air. In the oceans of a red dwarf planet, electrical communication might evolve as it has on Earth. It would be particularly useful in dark waters where vision is limited, such as the night-side ocean depths. Social structures could range from solitary to highly social, depending on ecological conditions. Solitary lifestyles are favored when resources are dispersed, and when cooperation offers no particular advantage. Highly social lifestyles evolve when cooperation provides benefits like better defense against predators, more efficient food acquisition, or shared care of offspring. On a red dwarf planet, the patchy distribution of resources might favor social behavior in some environments. If photosynthetic productivity is concentrated in specific zones, like the Terminator or substellar region, then organisms exploiting those zones might benefit from cooperation in defending territories or harvesting resources. Conversely, if flares are a major threat, group living might allow for better detection and collective defense, with some individuals serving as sentinels. The concept of daily activity patterns would not apply in the same way as on Earth. On Earth, most organisms are either diurnal, active during the day, or nocturnal, active at night, with these patterns driven by predation pressure, temperature, and light availability. On a tidally locked planet, there are no day-night cycles at a given location. Instead, activity patterns might be driven by stellar flare cycles tidal cycles if the planet has moons, or internal biological rhythms. Organisms might have active and rest phases that are not synchronized with external cues, but rather run on internal timers. Alternatively, if stellar activity varies in a predictable way, organisms might synchronize their activity to those variations, being most active during calm periods and resting or seeking shelter during flare episodes. Migration between zones could be a form of social behavior if groups move together. A herd or flock of organisms might migrate from the day side to the terminator during periods of high flare activity, then return when conditions improve. Such coordinated movement would require communication and some form of leadership or consensus decision-making. The navigational challenges of moving between zones would favor organisms that cooperate and share information about conditions ahead. Cultural transmission, the passing of learned behaviors from one generation to the next, is rare on Earth, but present in some species like primates, cetaceans, and birds. On a red dwarf planet, if intelligent species evolve, cultural transmission could be crucial for survival. Knowledge about safe zones, flare warning signs, and resource locations could be passed down through generations, allowing populations to thrive even in challenging environments. Should intelligent, technologically capable life evolve on a red dwarf planet, a possibility that remains entirely speculative, it would face environmental challenges and opportunities quite different from those that shaped human development on Earth. The environmental conditions of a tidally locked world, the radiation hazards, and the unusual stellar spectrum would all influence the trajectory of technological development. Though we can only infer how based on our understanding of physical constraints and biological needs. The first technologies would logically address immediate survival needs, much as early human technologies did. Shelter from radiation would be essential on the day side, suggesting that an intelligent species could initially inhabit caves or construct underground habitations, venturing to the surface only when necessary. These structures would need to block harmful ultraviolet and other radiation while allowing air circulation and access to resources. The development of agriculture or equivalent food production technologies would be influenced by the distribution of photosynthetic organisms. If primary productivity is concentrated in specific zones, settlements might cluster there, or trade networks might develop to transport food from productive regions to other areas. Alternatively, if chemosynthesis is viable in certain regions, settlements might be located near energy sources like hydrothermal vents. The constant illumination on the day side and darkness on the night side would affect daily life and work patterns. On Earth, human circadian rhythms are entrained to the 24-hour day, and artificial lighting allows us to be active at night if needed. On a tidally locked planet, particularly in the terminator zone, light levels would be constant. An intelligent species might develop activity patterns based on social conventions or internal rhythms rather than on external light cues. Energy sources for technology would be abundant in some forms and scarce in others. Solar energy would be plentiful and consistent on the day side, with the star always at the same position in the sky. A civilization could construct solar power arrays that track the sun's position, but on a tidally locked world, no tracking would be necessary. The panels could be permanently oriented toward the star. This simplicity might make solar power more attractive than it is on Earth. However, solar power would be unavailable on the night side. Settlements, there would need alternative energy sources, geothermal, nuclear, chemical, or energy transmitted from the day side. The wind patterns on a tidally locked planet, with strong, consistent flows from day to night side, might make wind power an excellent option, particularly in the terminator zone where winds converge. Communication technologies would need to be robust against electromagnetic interference from stellar flares. Radio communication, which is sensitive to ionospheric disturbances, might be difficult or unreliable during flare events. A civilization might develop alternative communication methods. Optical lasers that travel through the atmosphere without ionospheric effects, or buried cables that are shielded from radiation. Space exploration from a red dwarf planet would present unique challenges. The intense radiation environment near the star would make space travel hazardous, requiring heavy shielding for spacecraft and astronauts. However, the lower escape velocity from a small planet would make launches easier than on Earth. If the planet is tidally locked and has lower mass than Earth, space launch might be more accessible, potentially accelerating space exploration despite the radiation hazards. A civilization with advanced technology might eventually consider terraforming or planetary engineering. If the planet lacks a thick atmosphere, it might be possible to artificially thicken it, improving heat distribution and radiation protection. If atmospheric oxygen levels are low, the civilization might engineer organisms or build machines to produce oxygen. If the day side is too hot and the night side too cold, atmospheric management could redistribute heat more efficiently. The timescales available for technological development are remarkable. Red dwarfs live for trillions of years. A civilization that arose even early in a red dwarf's life would have unimaginable spans of time ahead. This longevity might encourage long-term thinking and planning on scales that human civilization has never contemplated. Projects that would take thousands or millions of years could be contemplated and executed. On the other hand, the radiation environment might make certain technologies difficult to develop. Sensitive electronics can be damaged by radiation. A civilization might develop radiation-hardened electronics from the beginning, or it might rely more on mechanical or biological technologies that are less sensitive to radiation. The evolution of technology would be shaped by the local constraints. Astronomy from a tidally locked planet would be unique. Observers on the night side would have a permanent view of the stars, uninterrupted by daylight. The absence of a day-night cycle would allow continuous observation of any object in the sky, limited only by the need to maintain instruments. However, atmospheric scintillation, the twinkling of stars due to atmospheric turbulence, might be severe in the terminator region where day and night side air masses meet. The presence of other planets in the system might be easier to detect than from Earth. Transits, when a planet passes in front of its star, cause measurable dimming. An observer on one TRAPPIST-1 planet, for example, would regularly see other planets transit the star, experiencing mini-eclipses. These would be valuable for astronomers, allowing direct measurement of other planet sizes and orbital periods. The question of whether such a civilization would develop spaceflight and attempt to leave its planet depends on many factors. The hazards of the local space environment might discourage space exploration, or they might encourage it as a means of escaping those hazards. The close proximity of other planets in the system, as in TRAPPIST-1, might make interplanetary travel more appealing than in our solar system, where planets are more widely separated. Communication with civilizations on other planets would face the light speed delay common to all interstellar communication. But for nearby red dwarf systems, the delays would be manageable. A civilization in the TRAPPIST-1 system communicating with us would experience about 40 years for each round-trip message. Within their own solar system, communication between planets would be nearly instantaneous, taking only seconds or minutes. The ethical considerations of a civilization's impact on its environment would be shaped by the particular conditions of the red dwarf planet. If life is sparse and concentrated in specific zones, environmental protection might focus on preserving those zones. If life is globally distributed, but fragile, ethical frameworks might emphasize caution in planetary engineering or expansion. The longevity of the star might also influence ethical thinking, creating a sense of stewardship over timescales that far exceed human generational thinking. Throughout this exploration, we have frequently compared potential red dwarf life with life on Earth, using Earth as our only reference point for understanding biology. But how different might life on a red dwarf planet actually be? Would it use the same basic biochemistry, the same genetic code, the same fundamental molecules? Or might it be alien in more profound ways? Carbon-based life, using carbon as the backbone of organic molecules, is assumed for life on red dwarf planets because carbon's chemistry is so versatile. Carbon forms stable bonds with itself and with other elements, creating the complex molecules necessary for life. Water is assumed as the solvent because it is abundant, liquid over a useful temperature range at Earth-like pressures, and dissolves many important compounds. These assumptions might hold for red dwarf planets, or they might not. Silicon is sometimes proposed as an alternative to carbon. Silicon sits below carbon on the periodic table and shares some chemical properties. However, silicon-based molecules are generally less stable and less diverse than carbon-based ones. In Earth's environment, silicon biochemistry seems unworkable, but under different conditions, perhaps at higher temperatures or with different solvents, silicon biochemistry might be viable. A red dwarf planet with unusual chemistry might, in theory, host silicon-based life. Alternative solvents are another possibility. Ammonia, which freezes at -78 degrees Celsius and boils at -33 degrees, could be a solvent for life on a very cold world. Methane and ethane, which are liquid at even lower temperatures, are present in liquid form on Titan, Saturn's largest moon. While Titan orbits a yellow dwarf star, the same principles could apply to cold moons or planets around red dwarfs. However, for a planet in the habitable zone of a red dwarf, where temperatures allow liquid water, water is the most likely solvent. The biochemistry might still differ in details, different amino acids, different nucleotides, different metabolic pathways. But the fundamental framework of carbon, water, and similar classes of molecules would probably apply. The genetic code on Earth is nearly universal, with all life using the same set of 20 amino acids and the same mapping from DNA triplets to amino acids, with only minor variations. This universality suggests that the code arose early in Earth's history and was then inherited by all subsequent life. On a red dwarf planet, life would independently evolve its own genetic code. It might use different amino acids, different nucleotide bases, or even a fundamentally different coding system. One can imagine a genetic code that uses more than 4 nucleotide bases, potentially encoding more information per DNA strand. Earth's code uses 4 bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, paired in 2 complementary pairs. A system with 6 bases in 3 complementary pairs would allow for more coding capacity. Alternatively, a system might use different molecular structures altogether for information storage and transfer. Metabolism, the set of chemical reactions that sustain life, would be shaped by the available energy sources and the environmental conditions. On Earth, metabolism is based on oxidation-reduction reactions, where electrons are transferred from one molecule to another, releasing energy. The same principle would apply on a red dwarf planet, but the specific molecules involved might differ. For example, if atmospheric oxygen is scarce, anaerobic metabolisms, which do not use oxygen, would dominate. Earth has many anaerobic organisms that use sulfate, nitrate, or ferric iron as electron acceptors instead of oxygen. On a red dwarf planet, similar alternative metabolisms might be the norm, with oxygen-based respiration being rare or absent. Photosynthesis, as we have discussed, would use different pigments and possibly different reaction centers to harvest the redder light. But the basic principle, using light energy to drive chemical reactions, would be the same. The products of photosynthesis might also differ. On Earth, oxygenic photosynthesis splits water and releases oxygen. On a red dwarf planet, life might split other molecules, releasing different gases. Cell structure might also show variations. Earth cells are surrounded by lipid membranes that regulate what enters and leaves the cell. These membranes work well in water at Earth's temperature range. On a planet with different temperatures, different pressures, or different chemical conditions, cell membranes might have different compositions. The basic concept of a barrier separating inside from outside would remain, but the molecular details could vary. Proteins, the workhorses of Earth cells, are chains of amino acids folded into specific three-dimensional shapes. The shape of a protein determines its function, and that shape depends on the sequence of amino acids. Red dwarf planet life would likely also use proteins, but possibly with different amino acid sets. Earth life uses 20 standard amino acids, but many others exist. Life elsewhere might use a different set, expanding or restricting its protein chemistry. The handedness of molecules, or chirality, is another aspect that might vary. On Earth, amino acids used in proteins are all left-handed, and sugars used in nucleic acids are all right-handed. This universal chirality arose early and was then maintained because mixing left and right forms would create problems for molecular interactions. On a red dwarf planet, life might independently choose a chirality, which could be the opposite of Earth's, or could use a mix in ways Earth life does not. Despite these potential differences, life on a red dwarf planet and life on Earth would share fundamental requirements. Both need energy, both need to maintain themselves and reproduce, both need to respond to their environments. These universal needs would drive convergent evolution toward similar solutions, even if the molecular details differ. Eyes evolve independently many times on Earth. They would likely evolve on red dwarf planets too, though they might see different wavelengths. Life on Earth has been evolving for nearly 4 billion years, and it will continue to evolve for billions more, until the sun exhausts its fuel and begins to die. The timeline for life on a red dwarf planet is even longer. With trillions of years available, life could reach levels of complexity and diversity far beyond anything Earth has achieved. On Earth, the evolution of complex multicellular life took about 3 billion years after the origin of life. Single-celled organisms dominated for most of Earth's history. The Cambrian explosion, when most major animal groups appeared, occurred about 540 million years ago. If similar timescales apply to red dwarf planets, and if life arises early in the star's lifetime, there would be ample time for complexity to evolve multiple times over. After billions of years, assuming life persists and thrives, ecosystems on a red dwarf planet might reach extraordinary sophistication. Organisms might evolve abilities that seem fantastical to us. Ultra-efficient photosynthesis, near-perfect radiation resistance, extreme longevity, complex societies, or even intelligence surpassing human levels. The sheer span of time allows for evolutionary experimentation on a scale Earth's life has not experienced. Climate on the planet would remain relatively stable over these immense timescales. Red dwarfs do not change much after they settle onto the main sequence. Unlike the Sun, which will gradually brighten and eventually become a red giant, red dwarfs will maintain nearly constant luminosity for trillions of years. This stability could favor the evolution of long-lived ecosystems and species that persist for hundreds of millions or billions of years. However, not everything would remain constant. Geological processes would continue. Volcanic activity, plate tectonics if present, weathering, and erosion. Over billions of years, continents might move, mountains rise and fall, and ocean basins open and close. These changes would create new habitats and destroy old ones, driving evolutionary turnover as species adapt or go extinct. Asteroid and comet impacts might periodically disrupt the biosphere. Earth has experienced several mass extinctions caused by large impacts, most famously the one that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Red dwarf planets would face similar risks. The frequency of impacts depends on the planet's location in its stellar system and the presence of other planets whose gravity might deflect or capture impactors. Stellar evolution, though slow, would eventually matter. Even red dwarfs evolve, albeit at a glacial pace. Over tens or hundreds of billions of years, a red dwarf's luminosity decreases slightly as its hydrogen content diminishes. Eventually, after trillions of years, the star will exhaust its hydrogen and begin to change more dramatically. For the smallest red dwarfs, this transition will take longer than the current age of the universe, many times over. When a red dwarf finally exhausts its hydrogen, it will contract and heat up, becoming a blue dwarf. During this phase, its luminosity will increase, and the habitable zone will shift outward. Planets that were once temperate might become too hot, while planets that were too cold might enter the habitable zone. Life would need to adapt to these changing conditions, or migrate if capable. Eventually, the blue dwarf will exhaust all nuclear fuel and become a white dwarf, a dense, slowly cooling remnant. The habitable zone around a white dwarf is very close to the star, and any planets in that zone would likely have been destroyed or sterilized during the earlier phases of stellar evolution. Life that managed to survive the transition might persist for billions more years as the white dwarf cools, but eventually the star would become too dim to support habitable conditions. Given these timescales, life on a red dwarf planet could potentially persist for hundreds of billions of years under stable conditions, then undergo a challenging transition as the star evolves, and possibly continue for billions more around the white dwarf remnant. The total lifetime of life on such a planet could be a significant fraction of 1 trillion years, dwarfing the 10 billion year lifespan of Earth's biosphere. What might life achieve with so much time? On Earth, life has progressed from simple cells to multicellular organisms to complex ecosystems to intelligence in about 4 billion years. With hundreds of times more time available, life on a red dwarf planet could reach stages we cannot imagine. It might develop technologies that allow it to survive the stellar transition, perhaps by moving to artificial habitats or by engineering planetary conditions. Alternatively, life might remain simple for most of that time. Complexity is not inevitable. Bacteria have remained bacteria for billions of years on Earth, and they might remain so on other worlds. The path to complexity requires specific conditions and perhaps some luck. A red dwarf planet might host microbial life for trillions of years without ever developing multicellular organisms, or it might develop multicellularity, but not intelligence. The question of whether intelligent life would arise brings us to the Fermi paradox. If red dwarf planets can host life, and if red dwarfs are the most common stars, then potentially habitable planets around red dwarfs vastly outnumber those around sun-like stars. Where, then, are all the civilizations? This is the paradox. The universe seems like it should be teeming with life, yet we see no evidence of it. Many solutions to the Fermi paradox have been proposed. Perhaps life is extremely rare. Perhaps intelligence is rare even when life is common. Perhaps civilizations destroy themselves soon after achieving technology. Perhaps they exist, but remain hidden for reasons we do not understand. Or perhaps the galaxy is indeed filled with life, but we have not yet looked in the right way or the right places. Red dwarf planets might be common sites for life without being common sites for technological civilizations. The harsh radiation environment, the challenges of tidal locking, and the dim, red light might all hinder the evolution of complex life or of intelligence. If life on red dwarf planets tends to remain microbial or to reach only modest complexity, then the galaxy could be full of living worlds without being full of civilizations. Conversely, if red dwarf planets prove hospitable to complex life, the sheer number of such planets might mean that most life in the galaxy actually exists around red dwarfs, with sun-like star systems being relatively rare exceptions. We, then, would be the unusual ones, living under a brighter, hotter star than most life-bearing worlds experience. The existence of life on red dwarf planets, whether confirmed or remaining speculative, carries profound implications for our understanding of life's place in the universe. If life can arise and thrive in such different conditions from Earth's, it suggests that life is a common outcome of planetary evolution, not a rare accident. The universe would be revealed as a place fundamentally friendly to life, with habitable environments available around the most common type of star. From a practical standpoint, the search for life beyond Earth must consider red dwarf planets seriously. Telescopes and missions designed to find biosignatures, chemical signs of life in planetary atmospheres, must account for the possibility that life exists around red dwarfs. This means studying planets with different atmospheric compositions, surface conditions, and stellar radiation environments than Earth experiences. The James Webb Space Telescope, with its infrared capabilities, is well suited to studying red dwarf planets. Many of the most interesting targets, like the TRAPPIST-1 planets, are being observed by Webb. The telescope can analyze the starlight filtering through the planet's atmospheres during transits, revealing the chemical composition. Detecting oxygen, methane, water vapor, and other molecules could provide evidence for habitability, or even for life. Future missions might include dedicated searches for biosignatures around red dwarfs. The proposed life mission, for example, would use interferometry to directly image exoplanets in infrared light, specifically targeting rocky planets in the habitable zones of nearby red dwarfs. Such missions could provide definitive answers about whether life exists on these worlds. The discovery of life on a red dwarf planet would be one of the most significant scientific findings in history. It would prove that life is not unique to Earth, that the basic principles of biology apply across different stellar environments. It would also provide a second example of life, allowing comparisons that could reveal which aspects of life are universal and which are specific to Earth. If the life found is simple, microbial, it would still be revolutionary. It would show that at least simple life can arise independently in different environments. If the life is complex, multicellular, or intelligent, the implications would be even more profound. It would suggest that the evolution of complexity might be a common pathway given sufficient time and suitable conditions. For humanity, the knowledge that we are not alone, that life exists elsewhere, would reshape philosophy, religion, culture, and our sense of place in the cosmos. The discovery would force us to reconsider our uniqueness and our responsibilities. As perhaps one of many intelligent species in a living galaxy. Even without finding life, studying the habitability of red dwarf planets teaches us about the limits and possibilities of life. Each planet we study, whether it hosts life or not, adds to our understanding of what makes a world habitable. Over time, we build a statistical picture. What fraction of planets in habitable zones actually are habitable? What conditions must be met? What can prevent habitability even when conditions seem suitable? These questions have practical implications for the search for habitable worlds and for understanding our own planet's habitability. Earth's atmosphere, climate, and biosphere are complex systems that we still do not fully understand. Studying alien planets, even hypothetically, forces us to think about these systems in new ways, potentially revealing insights applicable to Earth. The study of red dwarf habitability also informs the search for life in our own solar system and in future interstellar missions. If life can exist in the challenging conditions of red dwarf planets, it strengthens the case for life in seemingly inhospitable places like the subsurface oceans of Europa or Enceladus, or in the methane lakes of Titan. It expands the definition of habitability and encourages us to search more broadly. From an existential perspective, the longevity of red dwarfs offers a hopeful vision for the far future. If life on Earth faces eventual extinction as the sun evolves, life elsewhere might continue for trillions of years. The universe as a whole might remain alive and vibrant for unimaginable spans of time, with intelligent civilizations rising, flourishing, and perhaps spreading between stars. Life might prove to be not a brief flicker in cosmic history, but an enduring feature of the universe. As we reach the end of this journey through the worlds of red dwarf stars, it is worth reflecting on what we have explored. We began by understanding red dwarfs themselves, small, cool, long-lived stars that dominate the galaxy. We examined the habitable zones around these stars, where planets might maintain liquid water despite orbiting so close that they become tidally locked. We explored the implications of tidal locking, where permanent day and night sides create environmental conditions unlike anything on Earth. We considered the powerful stellar flares that could threaten any atmospheres or life on these planets, and the evolutionary adaptations that might allow life to survive such radiation. We imagined photosynthetic organisms optimized for red light, chemosynthetic ecosystems on the night side, and diverse communities in the terminator zone. We looked at real red dwarf systems, Proxima Centauri, with its tantalizing planet Proxima b, TRAPPIST-1, with its 7 Earth-sized worlds, and others scattered across our galactic neighborhood. We contemplated the evolution of multicellular life, the sensory systems organisms might develop, and the forms of communication that could arise. We even speculated about technological civilizations and how they might adapt to life under a red sun. Throughout this exploration, we have seen that life on red dwarf planets would face challenges, but also opportunities. The challenges are significant: intense radiation, tidal locking, unusual light spectra, and long-term climate stability that reduces evolutionary pressure. The opportunities are equally significant: unimaginable timescales for evolution, stable habitable zones, abundant planets, and unique environmental niches. Whether life actually exists on any red dwarf planet remains unknown. We have not yet found definitive evidence for life beyond Earth, around red dwarfs, or anywhere else. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The universe is vast, and our searches have only just begun. With each new telescope, each new mission, each new observation, we come closer to answering one of humanity's oldest questions. Are we alone? The quiet probability remains that we are not. With trillions upon trillions of planets in the observable universe, and with red dwarfs being the most common stars, the number of potentially habitable worlds is staggering. Even if only a small fraction actually host life, and only a small fraction of those develop complex ecosystems, the total number of living worlds could be enormous. Imagine, somewhere out there, a planet orbiting a cool red star. One hemisphere basks in eternal crimson light, where dark vegetation sprawls across the landscape, harvesting every available photon. The terminator zone is a ring of perpetual twilight, where diverse ecosystems thrive under stable, gentle conditions. The night side is dark save for starlight, and perhaps the glow of bioluminescent organisms with chemosynthetic communities clustered around volcanic vents. On this world, life has adapted to conditions that would seem alien to us, yet it follows the same fundamental principles. It grows, reproduces, evolves, and fills every available niche. Perhaps simple organisms dominate, microbial mats and biofilms covering rocks and seafloors. Perhaps complexity has evolved, with multicellular organisms filling the roles of plants and animals, engaged in the ancient dance of predator and prey, of competition and cooperation. Perhaps, on some such world, intelligence has arisen. Beings who look up at the stars, different stars than we see, arranged in unfamiliar patterns, and wonder if they are alone. Who develop science and technology to understand their cosmos. Who perhaps, one day, send messages into space, hoping that someone might hear. We search for these signals. We build telescopes to study distant planets. We calculate probabilities and model atmospheres and plan missions. And we wait, with patience and hope, for the moment when we find evidence that life has arisen elsewhere, that the principles of biology extend beyond Earth's blue skies. Until that moment arrives, we can imagine. We can explore these alien worlds in thought, guided by science, and by the understanding that the universe operates by the same physical laws everywhere. The red dwarf planets we have explored tonight are real places, or places like them exist in abundance. They orbit nearby stars, so close that with future technology, we might one day send probes or even visit them ourselves. These worlds represent both our future and our past, places where life might just be beginning its long journey toward complexity, or places where life has already achieved wonders we cannot yet imagine. In studying them, we learn about the possibilities for life in the universe. We learn that habitable worlds might be far more common than we once thought, scattered abundantly around the most numerous and longest-lived stars in the galaxy. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your mind wander among these crimson worlds. Picture the strange landscapes, the alien skies, the forms life might take under a different sun. Imagine the slow, patient passage of time on worlds where stars burn for trillions of years, where life has timescales we cannot comprehend, where the very concept of ancient takes on new meaning. The universe is vast and old, yet in a sense, it is young. Red dwarfs have barely begun their life cycles. Most of the stars that will ever exist have not yet formed. Most of the planets that will ever host life have not yet coalesced from their protoplanetary disks. We live in an early age of the cosmos, when galaxies still sparkle with new star formation, when planets are still settling into their orbits, when life, perhaps, is just beginning to wake up across countless worlds. You are part of this story. Your atoms were forged in stars, scattered by supernovae, gathered into a planet, and arranged into a living, thinking being. The same process might be happening right now around a red dwarf star, where molecules are combining in warm pools, or around hydrothermal vents, where the first self-replicating systems are forming, where life is taking its first tentative steps. Rest now. Let the universe continue its slow work. Stars will burn, planets will orbit, and life, wherever it exists, will continue its ancient patterns of growth and change. The cosmos does not hurry. It has all the time it needs. And so do you, in this quiet moment, as you settle into the peace of knowing that you are a part of something vast and wondrous, something that extends far beyond Earth, perhaps to red-lit worlds circling distant stars. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this exploration calming and enlightening, please like this video, subscribe to Alien Nature for Sleep, and share this with anyone who might enjoy a gentle voyage through the possibilities of life beyond Earth. May your dreams be filled with alien vistas and cosmic wonders.